Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon, friends. Welcome. This is John Hamre. I'm the president at CSIS, but our opportunity this afternoon is to feature some remarkable work, very important work that's been done by a commission that was assembled by associated universities. This is the National Commission on Grid Resilience. I personally don't think there's a more important or pressing question than America's capacity to protect its electric grid. If you think about it, there is only one critical infrastructure in America, and that's electricity. And we're going to talk about that today. We've got a remarkable group of people. I'm going to turn this over to the co-chairs who led this commission, and that's Wes Clark, General Wes Clark, who's an old friend. I'd just like to say he's held up a hell of a lot better than I have through the years, and I'm really delighted to be back in touch with him. And Representative Daryl Issa. And sir, it's great to have you back in Washington as a virtual participant, and we look forward to hearing both of you. So let me turn to the two of you to get this session going. Very important session. America needs to pay attention to this vital question that you've raised. Thank you all for doing it. And let me turn it to you, Wes and Daryl.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hamre. John, it's great to have your leadership here in getting this out to the public, because we believe that we're dealing here with one of the most fundamental vulnerabilities and one of the most important areas of homeland security in the United States, and that is the safety, security, reliability of our electric power supplies. So it's something that will affect every aspect of American life, every American. And it's something that, as we've come to understand it, we're increasingly vulnerable to having disruption in this provision of electricity. Now, I want to thank you, John, and CSIS for helping us put this together, and my fellow commissioners for the hard work, and AUI and Woodstar Labs for their work in supporting the commission. We're taking information from previous efforts when we put this commission together, and then we're taking it one step further. So let me recognize some of the previous efforts, which are good in this area, but have not yet either been fully implemented or haven't covered the newest array of the threats. There was the President's National Infrastructure Advisory Council, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, the Electricity Advisory Council, the Electric Power Research Institute, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. Lots of people have looked at this. Lots of people have their hands around and talking about and trying to work this problem, but it is an enormously difficult and complex problem to work. So that's why we've come together on this. I'd like to turn it over to my fellow co-chairman, Congressman Daryl Issa. Thanks, Daryl.
Well, thank you, Wes. When Colonel Wesley Clark, before he was General Wesley Clark, and I served together decades ago, he was deploying to Germany, to the front lines of the Soviet-U.S. engagement. And at that time, you just took your generators and your radios and you went there. The idea then that the now Russians would use cyber attacks on the grid to disable an enemy didn't exist. It wasn't in any of our warfighting scenarios for all the things we thought about the robustness of the then Soviet Union. But they've done that since that time. When we went into Tora Bora and we went into Osama bin Laden's cave, we found that he had an intention of attacking major transformers to take down portions of the US grid as a terrorist attack. Real? Yes. Accomplished? No. Very plausible? Yes. During my time in Congress, having had Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy, and yes, a tree falling in Cleveland that took down the whole Northeast corridor, we've had small reminders of what could happen. But when General Clark came to me and talked about this, we hadn't yet had this pandemic. We hadn't yet realized that America can survive because we can work from home, because we have an interdependent communication electrical system that allows us in the 21st century to do what couldn't be done when we were young military officers. It couldn't be done even a few decades ago. The fact is, this commission was timely because it brought together General Clark's recognition of the vulnerability and all of the other commissioners and past studies, and it brought it at a time when every American knows that, in fact, now or in the future, we're potentially going to have to work from home for any number of reasons. We're going to have those potential attacks, and we're going to have to survive them. So what we've laid out here is a path that I think with General Clark's leadership allows us to at least begin looking at the steps it would take to assure the American people that whether it's a cyber attack from, let's say, China, or it's a natural occurrence, or in fact a terrorist attack from a small group of radicals, that in fact America will not live in terror and our economy will not shut down. And so in the middle of a pandemic, doing this study, which we did all remotely, none of us were able to really get together personally, we realized that we lived by exactly what we're hoping that Congress and the next administration, whichever it is, will in fact recognize there's a lot of work to be done. And so I think as you hear from the commissioners, you're going to realize that the past, the near past, and the present we're living on all came together for this comprehensive roll-up of what needs to be done. And thank you, General Clark. I'm the co-chair, but in fact, I'm still the Army captain working for that lieutenant colonel in many ways.
Thanks, Daryl. Well, I'd like to call on Honorable Norm Augustine.
Well, thank you, General. And the overall electric grid was never designed from the ground up with a clean sheet of paper. Rather, it evolved over many years. And in the process of doing so, it has a number of inherent weaknesses or vulnerabilities. And today, there's been an evolving set of threats that you've just heard about. The threats could be categorized one way as natural, such as things as fires and floods and wind and lightning, or as intentional, that would include such things as physical attacks, cyber attacks, or electromagnetic attacks. The threats are complex, but many of the solutions don't have to be complex. And that's probably the good news here. Most people, as has been mentioned, are familiar one way or the other with losing power in their homes for an hour or two, or maybe even a day. Our focus, though, has been on disruptions to the electric grid that would deny power on a very broad scale, not for hours or days, but for weeks or for many months. And the consequences of such attacks are likely to be increased by our growing dependence upon electricity for communications, for transportation. For example, think of the number of people who are moving toward electric vehicles for their personal use, as well as industrial use of electric vehicles. At the same time, even today, most filling stations can't operate without electricity. Everything from the food supply to communications, from healthcare to the military, from transportation to the water supply are very susceptible to grid disruptions. Complicating factors, most of the grid is owned and operated by the private sector. But the shareholders of the private sector, to a very large extent, are generally intolerant of investments that produce uncertain benefits or long-term benefits. And because of that, the government has an extremely important role to play here in many roles, including providing such things as warning of threats. What should the private sector be concerned about? Providing incentives to defend against those threats, and particularly providing coordination between and within the government and the private sector. All very demanding but very essential positions and undertakings for the government if it's to lead the private sector, which of course in the end is going to be the one that has to make most of the changes that are made and the improvements. And we offer 9 recommendations, my colleagues and I, that address these, among other important concerns. And I believe, General Clark, you're going to begin with the first one.
Thank you very much, Norm. So yeah, we've got 9 recommendations here, and we're going to talk about these in detail. And then we're going to ask those of you in the audience to come back to us online, and we'll go into further detail and discuss these in greater depth with you on an individual basis. Look, this is a national security threat, but it's not widely recognized by the American people. And even the people who should be charged with protecting us from it often don't get the information they need. It kind of, the cyber threat in particular, it snuck up on us, honestly, because we always had cyber inside the U.S. Armed Forces. We've been working it for 25 years. But somehow we expected ourselves that we were ahead of everybody else. And as Congressman Issa mentioned, turned out that other people had the same idea. In 1999, 2 Chinese colonels wrote a book called Unrestricted Warfare, in which they discussed taking down American infrastructure as one of the key elements of warfare. Of course, that's against the laws of land warfare under the Geneva Convention, but who's able to count on that? We need our own protections. And we've been a little bit slow in mobilizing public opinion. So our first recommendation is we've got to get the threat out there and understood in a timely, effective manner so we can take actions against it. Now, first problem is we got to get the threat information to the utilities themselves, because they have to make the adjustments, do the personnel screening, they have to have the right cyber protections and take other measures as necessary. That's a responsibility of our government agencies, but it's also tied up in security clearance procedures. It's tied up in how classified information is released. And so we've made a number of small recommendations in this space to try to facilitate the flow of threat information. In 2015, the Russians actually took down part of the Ukrainian electricity grid. But it took a couple of years before America woke up to the fact that, yes, you could actually do this. You can actually use cyber to create kinetic effects on the grid. You can blow up transformers, shut down relay stations, and do irreparable damage using simply the bits and bytes of the internet. And so how this is done, the techniques and so forth, they come through classified research, but we're calling for that research to be made much more available, much more rapidly to our utility industry. We especially need to get it to the bulk power industry in the United States. If our adversaries have this information, what are we shielding it from our own forces for? So it needs to get out there to the private sector where they can take action, and to the federal agencies like the TVA and WAPA, who have responsibilities for providing electric power, but often don't understand the latest threat that is being directed against them. We need, for our control rooms that are handling the instantaneous dispatch and response to changes in the electrical grid, they need the ability to have instantaneous reporting to them on threats and possible mitigation measures, not delayed by months of security clearances and interagency processes. So this has to be streamlined. The existing agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Energy, and industry entities need expanded powers. We need to be able to name and shame hostile actions with emphasis on the frequency of the intrusions. So I know this risks indicating how much we know about adversaries, but I think it's a risk that we have to take as a nation, because we've got to get the American people and our private sector institutions to understand what we're up against. We need expanded security clearances to the appropriate congressional leadership and committee staff and to partners in the private sector. Now, there's been effort after effort over 20 years to facilitate security clearances, and we're still working this. But let's be very clear. Our electricity grid is a national asset. It's got to be protected. It cannot be protected if people are not brought in on the security level to understand exactly what the threats are. So we need priority in this area. One thing we can do is we can speed up what we call a tear line data, where the sources and methods are protected, but the intelligence itself is dispersed. And we need to build off a Department of Energy system called CRISP that puts this out now, but it's not fast enough. It's not detailed enough to take responsive action. If you just think about the electricity grid and how complicated it is, 500 some odd grid owners, public utility commissions, people voting in city councils about raising electricity rates, and all of these people in one way or another need to understand the vulnerability. So our first recommendation is, let's really improve our ability to communicate the challenge and threat. And by the way, one more thing we need is continuing exercises and red team simulations, so we can actually get the training and experience of handling these challenges inside an operating system. We've done this for years in our armed forces. We know how to do it, and we need to move as rapidly as possible throughout the government and commercial spaces in the electricity grid to bring this experience there. So that's number one. Let's get information out on the threat. I want to cover a second recommendation also. We need actually to build an organization that can bring focus and clarity to the issue of grid resilience. So we're recommending the creation of a National Resilient Grid Authority. That is, this authority would have absolutely advanced world-class red teaming capacity to identify and project the new threats, the vulnerabilities of the grid, and then learn how to defeat them before our adversaries can get there. We'd use it as a testing bed for the most advanced protection technologies, whether it's new cyber hardware, software, quick disconnects, or whatever it takes to deal with the threat. And we'll need a hybrid approach on this. Nothing is, as Norm Augustine said, it's a complex system, but the solution's not that hard. You just have to get people to talk together and work together. So we need the operational capabilities of an independent agency, but we also need research facilities. We need to and bring in people like the MIT Lincoln Labs. We need private-public partnerships. We need organizations like InQtel, which Norm was critical in founding, that bring all this together. And at the core of this NRGA, this National Resilient Grid Authority, would be an annual exercise cycle. So what we would do is, using our advanced red teaming capacities, we would specify and identify threats. We'd have an operational grid, microgrid system that's actually producing power. We would then invite the contractors, private sector, the developers, the labs to come in to try their defenses and learn what the threat is and apply it. We bring the utility industry in to observe it. We would incentivize then the application of these advanced technologies to strengthen our activity. And in this measure, we bring coherence to this very complicated provision of electricity. We'd stay on the cutting edge of technology, and we'd have a way of directly reaching out across this very broad sector with the latest threat information and the latest recommended responses to it. So this would be the National Renewable Grid, National Resilience Grid Authority, the NRGA. So those are the first two recommendations. Let's get the threat information out there. Let's build an institution, organization that can really bring this information together for us. Now I'd like to turn over to Adam Cohen to talk about our Advanced Resilience Technology Testbed Network recommendation.
Thank you, General. So in the spirit of sharing, as General Clark noted regarding intel and exercises under the NRGA, we need similar sharing of innovations, and we need to push those innovations forward rapidly and confidently. In other words, we need a way to test them and make sure that they are going to be deployed and work as advertised and only work as advertised. So the always and never concept. With that in mind, we recommend having a DoD/DOE Advanced Resilience Technology, or ART, testbed network. The emphasis of the network would be on blackout survivable microgrids, or safe haven secure microgrids, and the associated enabling technologies. These would be focused on both immediate defensive capabilities and rapid commercialization of new innovations for advanced resilience and security. This is intended to build off the existing DoD and DOE microgrids and other test capabilities. These are currently at present focused more on niche applications, but they could be expanded, and the whole mission could be looked at in a much broader sense as to how you both develop and implement the technologies that we need for both resilience and security. The testbed structural requirements, certainly they differ by facility, and they should be defined by the facility owner operators, DoD and DOE, along with the private partners in a public-private partnership. But overall, they should meet the broad goals of a network. At least one of the test beds we would recommend should be of sufficient scale to provide an integrated test site for combined transmission and distribution systems. And this could serve as a laboratory for end-to-end security and resilience testing. So that it's critical, if you want to get testing both on individual components as well as in situ testing, that you have a variety of those types of scales and capabilities. As I mentioned, this should be a public-private partnership, because this way it most effectively leverages the speed, efficiency, and effectiveness of the private sector construction and operation, but it has the advantage of the coordination of the public sector. The two major challenges that the ART microgrid test beds would focus on, one would be ensuring a plug-and-play functionality that avoids the vendor lock-in and allows for facility personnel to operate and repair the systems most efficiently. This is being pursued. Certainly, some of the DOE labs have looked at this type of thing. MIT Lincoln Labs has a tactical microgrid standard that they have pursued. The Army is issuing standards that there needs to be this type of plug and play or interchangeability. So I think this is a direction that's being headed in, and this ART network would enable testing in that kind of structure. The second challenge would be providing for dispatchable power, excuse me, to firm renewables without relying on fossil fuel supply lines. So certainly the microgrids are being deployed now, lots of backup power being provided by natural gas or by diesels. There is a thought that maybe batteries can provide some of this gap. The battery solution would be great, and that is one option, but another option that we actually looked at as being a very promising avenue is the SMR or the VSMR, the nuclear technologies. And that could be a very promising avenue to provide dispatchable power for microgrids. But in any case, the ART would be available to test those types of capabilities in situ. And so the recommendation would be to have this ART or Advanced Resilience Technology Testbed Network for the nation to be able to use and test these technologies. And with that, let me turn it over for recommendation 4 to Kevin Knobloch. Kevin, you're on mute.
Thank you, Adam. And thank you to all for joining us today. Recommendation 4 really recognizes that we are becoming increasingly dependent on renewable energy, that our electric grid is increasingly dependent on renewable energy. And in particular, we have this remarkable opportunity to build a new energy sector, offshore wind, tidal, wave energy, from scratch. And it's rare that we have the chance to design a new economic system, energy system, from literally the seabed up. And we also recognize that mapping out and thinking through the transmission pieces, both the new infrastructure that would be in the ocean, the wet side of that transmission, as well as the existing onshore grid, the electric grid of substations and transformers and the elaborate onshore grid, which frankly never was built in a way that never anticipated the onset of very large new injections of offshore wind. The 7 states along the eastern seaboard have committed to building nearly 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. That's the equivalent of 30 average size nuclear reactors. It's a lot of new energy, and we really, really do need to think this through. The commission really came to the conclusion that carefully planning out the offshore wind transmission grid is really essential to ensuring its resilience once it's built. What we recommend is that FERC take the lead, but work very closely with the relevant offices of the U.S. Department of Energy, Department of Interior, the regional ISOs and RTOs, the independent system operators and regional transmission organizations that are responsible for managing the onshore electric grid, as well as those states that have really stepped into the future by actively procuring new offshore wind farms and that energy and the associated transmission. So working closely with all of those actors, we recommend that FERC and its colleagues strengthen interregional transmission planning, cost allocation, and competitive bidding. Now, FERC has certainly paid attention to some of these issues, the need for planning, the need for competition. FERC Order 1000 is a very significant piece of that puzzle. But I think many folks, including former and to some extent current FERC commissioners, feel that FERC Order 1000 has fallen short of expectations, and that there's more work to be done, especially in terms of fostering transmission planning between regions. And in a way that takes into account what is really a widely dispersed renewable energy generation. And that can have some advantages from a resilience perspective, in that what more widely dispersed systems are inherently harder to attack physically. And then there are certainly some other benefits. The way that the states have really started to build offshore wind has been to invite wind developers to bid project by project. and to bundle transmission and generation, which is not the way that FERC has guided things onshore for decades. And so there really is an opportunity here to take a step back and move beyond project by project development and map out the entire whole with a strong eye on resiliency and security. And if we take that systems approach, we think that it's going to bring costs down, it's going to increase competition, and will benefit the ratepayers and all Americans who rely on our electric grid for their energy. The last thing I'll note is that FERC is taking leadership in this realm. They have convened a technical conference this October for the explicit purposes of exploring grid integration of offshore wind energy. And that's an exciting development. And we look forward to this recommendation being adopted and being implemented. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Kevin. It's great to see you again. And I want to reiterate the thanks for John Hamre and CSIS for hosting this event, and for General Clark and Congressman Issa leading this effort. I'm going to address recommendation 5, which is that Congress should direct the Department of Energy and the Department of Homeland Security to create a voluntary central repository of information regarding security and resilience investments in the electric power system. And let me say why that's so important. As Norm Augustine said in his earlier remarks, the vast majority of the assets that are at threat here, whether they're from a human origin threat or natural phenomenon threat, are in private hands. And I had a lot of experience at the Department of Energy in dealing with utility CEOs who were facing very tough investment decisions, and they had public utility commissions and shareholders to answer to for the investments they make. Some of the investments in resilience can be expensive, and it's a classic situation of investing in a perhaps low probability but very high consequence event. And how is a CEO to think about that? And how is a CEO to justify making these investment decisions? It's a hard thing to do. But we faced this question before when we all were threatened by the impending doom we all feared from the Y2K computer snafus that were widely projected in the late 1990s. And we discovered the power of standards. And that's something that this commission has, I think, wisely embraced, because the use of standards give utility executives and other investors the basis upon which to make very tough and important decisions to invest the significant resources required to get the resilience enhanced in the country. These standards can come in a variety of forms. We talk about rating agencies and the requirements that they can impose upon companies. There are insurance companies that may only insure a risk if they get certain assurances of resilience, so that they know that the mitigation of those risks is well in hand. There's also the possibility of using publicly audited financial statements in which a CEO and a CFO may need to certify that certain standards are being met. Now, the other part of the recommendation, apart from standards, improving standards, is to improve reporting, because, of course, the standards are only as good as the data that supports them. And therefore, our commission has recommended that the Department of Energy and the Department of Homeland Security should create a voluntary central repository of information for security and resilience investments. That's the kind of database that can underpin the drafting and promulgation of smart standards, which, of course, are the kinds that we want. We would invite utilities and other stakeholders to submit annual reports, and then these reports in turn would form the basis for cost recovery arguments to regulators and explanations to shareholders, and basically can inform how ongoing changes can be made that are required to keep our system resilient in an era in which the liabilities can be just phenomenal. Witness the recent tragic experience in California with the PG&E fire situation. There are a number of places that one could house this database. There are entities within both the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Energy that can serve this function. I had the privilege to lead as the government co-chair for a number of years, the electricity subsector coordinating committee, which works closely with the electricity information sharing and analysis sector, commonly known as EISAC. These are all potential homes for the database, and wherever it is housed, the data that comes out of these databases should be fed into the Department of Energy North American Energy Resilience Model so that it can inform long-term investment decisions that the U.S. Department of Energy is making. Because even though, as I said at the beginning, most of the assets are in the private sector, the Department of Energy still has a profoundly important technology development role in providing the kind of resilience technologies and solutions that we need. Finally, all of us here are deeply aware of the current and impending climate changes that are affecting everything around us, and certainly among the many things they affect are the resilience of the grid. And it is to be expected that the threats facing our grids are going to evolve with time, and frankly, they're going to worsen. And therefore, we also call on the National Institute for Standards and Technology to take into account the projected and impending climate and weather changes, of which there's a growing and actually quite substantial amount of data, to help ensure that we're not just making investments today, but that we're investing today for the kinds of threats that we're likely to face in the years to come. Because the classic line of the hockey great Wayne Gretzky is, he was successful not because he skated to where the puck was, but where it was going to be. And so we have to be smart and heads up about these investments, and not just build, I see General Clark there, Maginot lines against yesterday's threat. We need to get ahead of the curve. And through this kind of data set that we're talking about, a more robust and more current and continually updated data set, and translating that data set in turns into smart standards that can help guide investment decisions, and then finally to wrap that into forward-looking activities, both in the executive branch by the Department of Energy and through NIST, and the possibility of taking into account these climate changes and how to mitigate against them by a smart investment strategy. We believe that's a strong recommendation that we hope people will follow. And with that, I will turn to General Kern.
Thank you, appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who's listening in and paying attention to the problems. You know, we've listened to a lot of issues that are out there and a lot of recommendations to this point that we have to solve. It took us over 100 years to get here. We built this grid piece by piece through public utilities and through government work and through different sources of energy, many of which have been discussed. But let's not be naive. We have to pay for the problem to be solved today. And this is not going to be overnight. It's going to take us some years to solve this problem. And it's going to take both public and private investment to get there. So what we're suggesting in our next recommendation is some of the incentives that are going to be required to really get people to think about, how do you do this? Nobody wants to see their tax bill go up every day. Nobody wants to see their electric kilowatt hour bill go up every day. And so what are the incentives that we can use to provide people the right focus on how we can actually pay for this, both public and private? And I think we keep coming back to that point, is this really has to be the incentives that get both sides of this moving in the right direction. So let me talk a little bit about some of those we looked about. The first is to pass a Resilient Investment Tax Credit, RITC, to incentivize investments in the cyber, physical, and American manufactured transmission components and equipment, and EMP, electromagnetic pulse security, which we haven't touched on too much, but a real potential problem in addition to all of the other issues that we're facing our grid. So as we look at these kinds of issues, then these incentives then give us some ways for people actually to get a recovery from their own investments back into it. And it's a real necessity as we look at that. For an illustration, if we devoted 5% of the 2017 tax-related support for the energy sector to grid security resilience, that would amount to about $1 billion. Presuming a 30% RITC, such expenditures can leverage $3.3 billion in resilience spending, nearly 3/4 of the ARRA spending on grid modernization at only 1/5 of the cost. That sounds like complicated math. And it is if you sit down with all of doing your taxes and everybody looks at it. But that is what we need a big focus on. We don't have a single CFO out there to guide us through this. This has to be a public and a private focus on how we get through. And those investment credits provide a really significant part to that. Secondly, we ought to direct federal spending toward resilience and security investments in federally owned electric supplies. Things like the TVA that everybody knows about, but there are others, the BPA, the WAPA, the SWPA, and CEPA. An end-use federal facility using energy applications, using grid-connected devices, electric vehicle fleets and charging infrastructure, distributed energy resources. And so we're not looking at just one source of energy, we're looking at multiple sources of energies and how you bring them together and how you incentivize people to do that. So the federal government has a role to play then in that, not just the utility companies, but also the federal government. Recovery efforts also offer us a major weather disasters, a low hanging fruit solution. We often lose a lot of power during great storms, hurricanes, floods, windstorms. We watch the power lines come down. We watch all of these other impacts on our grid resilience. As opposed to just replacing what was there before, we can do it smart. We can actually then replace with a much better solution. I can give you a very simple example. A location I know of has a golf course that had an underground power structure across it. Well, most people don't play golf at night. And so they said, you know, it's going to cost us a lot of money to replace this underground system. But if we use solar power at each of these locations we need it, we can get the power where we want it at 1/10 the cost of doing a repair. And so people are already thinking that way, that under a small example, but when you apply that to things like Katrina or the disasters in Manhattan and look at it from a completely new structure, that gives us great advantage. So supporting the public and private partnerships that marry the private capital with the public needs to provide breathing room for public finances while encouraging the private sector innovation is one of the things that we can do in leveraging through these disasters. And finally, the state public utility commission should develop new methods of valuing resilience. How do you put a value on something that is not a monetary factor in your current planning? So we need to do that. We need to put a value on resilience investments in the private sector so that they can be included in the expenditures in the utility rate-based calculations. That's a factor that the metric that we are missing today in terms of how is resilience noted when the utility commission rates its bills. So these are some of the few ideas that we've looked at. I'm sure that more people will come up with better ideas over time, but we do need to make sure that we have incentivized people to make the right investments, do it at the right times, and look at all sources as they do those investments in resilience. Thank you. Back to Congressman Issa. You're muted. Congressman, you're muted.
My best lines have been lost. As we went through this and got to recommendation 7, we got to it really because every other recommendation tends to have a broad amount of little cubes that we could make a recommendation to, meaning that we could ask for executive action. We could ask that the National Security Advisor or the Homeland Security Advisor take a leading role. We could look at Department of Energy and its subsets versus others. So we made our best recommendations for where in the organizational chart, whether it was congressional action or executive action. But when we got to the question of Congress itself, which is organized with a lot of different jurisdictions, energy falling under multiple committees. Obviously, the Department of Defense has a role here, and a number of other committees. What we realized was Congress also had to have an organization with a focus for this. And so our recommendation that they form a bipartisan caucus. These things have a strong tendency to operate better than committees because they don't really change who's in charge when a party changes at the speaker level. But they also tend to have a coalition of the willing, so that this caucus would easily be able to have people who are national defense concerned, people who are energy concerned, people who see climate change as a particular threat. Obviously, some of the people from the Science Committee who are looking at weather events. So it's important because the only way we're going to get Congress to be completely supportive and knowledgeable is to have a single point on this issue. And so the recommendation goes out there. I'm very fortunate. I've been able to talk to some of the chairman and ranking members who very quickly realized that they'd love to have committee hearings on it. But the reality is, on a long-term basis, no one committee can solve this. So that's been a big part of it. Lastly, I think one of the things that General Clark has recognized is that when we first started talking about this, we saw this as a commission that would complete its work, hand it off to the two presidential nominees for their consideration going forward. But it's pretty clear by the time the commission had done its work that it's larger than that. This is going to need to be something that Congress on an ongoing basis goes back to the commissioners, go back to the stakeholders, and realize that this will take a while and multiple administrations to solve. So I think in addition to affecting national policy, it is pretty clear that we have to have an ongoing contact with Congress if we're going to get the kind of follow through we need on a problem that does go back decades. So I get the honor of saying I'm done. Now we can go to Greta, who totally owns recommendation 8, and I'm really happy that she came in and added so much as a commissioner. So thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Issa, and thank you, gentlemen. I would like to talk about one of the recommendations. It's what do we do in the meantime while we're developing these standards, trying to cooperate more with industry, move ahead. We have to have a fail-safe. And I actually have a lot of experience in this. I had the honor of co-chairing the 2007, I guess, was the unclassified report, Defense Science Board Energy Security Task Force, which in fact recommended that we need to have spares and backups for our largest transformers, which is essentially a strategic petroleum reserve now. If you think about it, in World War II, I remember seeing a Navy poster that, fuel is ammunition. Well, we've come to a world where electricity is ammunition, and in fact, it enables our way of life. I really agree with what John Hamre had to say. It is the infrastructure. All other infrastructures are dependent on it. So it's going to take a long time to develop standards, to write the legislation, to what can we do? We recommended in DSB that we have a strategic transformer reserve. DoD worked on that. As a matter of fact, brought in with DOE and DHS the manufacturing capability back into the United States, which had only existed overseas at the time. And there are several original equipment manufacturers that can make these things. They put the factories together, but there are no orders and they haven't been asked to do it. And the utilities do not want to spend the money. And so it's critically important. And the government does know and can identify on a continuing basis, because circumstances change, which transformers, especially the largest ones and the extra large ones that are like moving the space shuttle into place, which ones are the most critical. And so we strongly recommend, and I'm so glad that my colleagues all agree on this, that we need to establish a transformer reserve. We have this in the Merchant Marine, we have this in the Defense Industrial Base, and I've seen many times, for example, at NASA, when you let it go, it's difficult to rebuild it. After the Apollo program, NASA faced that, and there was a huge generation gap in the capability. So now the original equipment manufacturers are telling us that we have to rebuild the expertise and the capability of actually building the transformers that we used to know how to make. In the meantime, the prices have gone way down overseas, and we are getting imports from adversarial countries that cannot be trusted. And there's a substantial amount of detail on that in the report, and the government is working on that. And from other countries as well. The price differential that the OEMs have quoted to me is minimum 25 to 30%. I'm trying to get that confirmed. But to look at this as a insurance and a cost benefit analysis and a cost avoidance analysis, we have seen what COVID-19 did to the economy. Losing power for months or up to a year, which is what it takes these large transformers, and there are hundreds, if not thousands. It'll do what we saw with COVID-19, I'm sorry to say, but that's just a matter of fact. So I would really like to encourage the entire national security community and everyone else that's listening to push for this, because we need it. We must have spares. And they're so difficult to move that the federal government's going to have help the utilities move them back into place. The second recommendation is something, it's for the long haul, but we need to start this right away. And that is, and keying off what some of the other commissioners have said, the climate is going to continue to change regardless of what whoever thinks is causing it. It's changing. We know that. We see it in the weather. And there's a substantial amount of unanimity on this. The electric grid is in danger of climate change impacts, everything from sea level rise to fires. We have to look at these changes that are coming over the useful life of the equipment, which is 30, 50 years plus. The PG&E transmission that burned in Paradise, California, that line was 108 years old. I'm speaking with some of the original equipment manufacturers. They're telling me that some of these transformers are 1960, which seems by comparison relatively young. However, and let me talk about California, because I've been working on this with the state government and FEMA for the last couple of years. It's not widely known that that I think it was the 2018 fire actually came within 8 miles of the transmission that supports 2 military bases in California. And that may not seem like it's very close, but these fires were moving at hurricane category 1 force wind and tropical storm force winds. And that means 1 football field a second. So the Santa Ana winds have changed. They've moved north, and they've become extremely erratic to predict. Wind is probably the most difficult thing to predict in the weather and in the climate. And so we have to take preventative measures on this and try to map the changes that we expect in the climate and in midterm weather, El Nino and all the rest of it against the electric grid. And we need to do this nationwide. There's another example in California that's not widely known. In one of the rural counties, the Office of Emergency Services in one of the rural counties had to actually pick up and run with their computers because the fire was so close. This is not very smart of us, and we need to change that as well. And what the commissioner tried, just like to say, I mean, we need to create places with a safe grid that's sited where our most critical infrastructure, our most critical government, our most critical industries, water, telecom, can stage things so that when things get bad, we can help others. I like to talk about the oxygen mask principle on aircrafts, and that is that the stew stands up and says, if you're stronger, put your mask on first so you can help those who can't. And this is the attitude that we need to take with the modeling, with the safe havens, with the transformer reserve. And with that, I'll stop and hand it back to General Clark. I just have to say that I'm deeply grateful for all of you taking this on and ready to go to see if we can make some progress.
Well, Greta, thank you, and thanks to all the commissioners and CSIS. So there you have it. We've got a real significant threat, a set of threats to our way of life through the threats to and vulnerabilities in the electricity grid. We've got threats from natural disasters, threats from climate change, threats from terrorism, threats from hostile state actors through cyber or electromagnetic pulse emanations. We've got to get that threat information out and get our complex electricity system mobilized to deal with it. We recommended we create a national resilience grid authority to run as a test bed, not only to generate electricity, but to keep us on the forefront of advanced threats and advanced responses, working in partnership with all of our agencies and industry. As part of that, we need to build some advanced resilience technology test beds, and we would hope to do this with public-private partnerships. We know we need to improve the standards and reporting for our investments in grid resilience. It's simply not available today. It needs to be worked so it can guide us in our future investments. And along with that, of course, we need incentives, a resilience investment tax credit and direct federal funding for the bulk energy providers that come from the federal system. We need improved oversight and improved leadership in dealing with this challenge. That oversight should come from a congressional caucus, the leadership through the coordination of the National Security Council in the executive branch. We need to look at the supply chain, especially for the large transformers, and establish a real reserve and build up domestic manufacturing capacity. And we need to be very attentive to siting, because our siting increases or decreases our vulnerability, not only transmissions, but locations of power stations, even where the transformer reserves are held. So that's it. We said 9 recommendations. It's probably 900 if you go through the report. And for those of you who are listening, each of our commissioners has pledged that they will continue to push in their own channels with their own expertise and relationships to have significant progress in this space. And we ask you, as our listeners, to join with us in that. Now, read the full report. It's at gridresilience.org and weigh in on this. This is a problem that America has to address. It's not just for the federal government. It's not just for the state governments. It's not just for the private sector. It's all of us. We've done the easy part. We've collected the challenge and made some suggestions. Now comes the hard part, getting it done. We need your help. Thank you.